All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the first Talmud class of this Hebrew year. The Rabbi's class is sponsored by the Susser Foundation, the Skiba family, the Sheeran family, and in memory of Libby and Harold Grill. Rabbi, take it away.
Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you, everyone, for being here with me. And I would like to explain to you what my plans for this year look like. So the idea is to talk a little bit about Jewish law, about Jewish legislation. So our first year, last year, was focused on legends, on myths. And we talked about several different stories, Talmudic stories. The idea today is not to talk about stories, but to talk about law, about legislation. And we will use the Siddur as the guideline for our conversations, and we will focus in different prayers. Today we will talk a little bit about the Psukei de Zimra, and then in one or two meetings we will go to Shema, and then Amidah, and so on. And by understanding the prayer that we see in front of us in our Siddur, and the development of the same prayer throughout history, I want to dive with you into the process of Jewish law determining, law legislation, how Judaism determines law. And as a very, very general introduction, our first and most important book for Jewish law is the Torah. And at the same time, this is the least important book for actually getting to know how to proceed, how to act, how to behave. Does someone can explain my last affirmation? Why is the Torah relevant and irrelevant at the same time for Jewish legislation? Yes, Elliot.
I take it that you're saying that the Torah are the guidelines, and how we enforce the guidelines is how we should deal with the law. So it just gives us a major overview of what we should be considering in the Torah.
Yes, we draw the principle, the values from the Torah. So the Torah is the beginning, but the Torah is never the end of any given law, any given conversation. So if someone comes from another world and we give this person the Torah and say, those are the Jews, so the person will think that we have several wives, we make sacrifices in our backyards, we have slaves. And actually, this is not exactly what I do. I don't know about you, but it's not exactly how I practice my Judaism. So the beginning of any legislation, the root, the origin is connected to the Torah, because the Torah is like a constitution of the Jewish people. But the development is very, very important. And normally the development took it to a very, very, very different place. So we need the Torah to understand the beginning, but we need to understand the history and the development in order to get to know how to behave. So if the Torah is the general constitution, after the Torah time, the Torah period, it was very important to transform those general values into practical laws. And then we came to the Talmud time. And during the Talmud time, both Mishnah and Gemara, the different parts of the Talmud, are constituted by a whole bunch of debates and conversations and discussions on how to transform those general values into practice, how to actually act into the world, taking into consideration those values. So just to give a general example, we need to love the stranger, the ger. We are commanded by the Torah to love the ger, the stranger. But the Torah does not explain us how. What does it mean to love the stranger? Does it mean to marry the stranger? Does it mean to bring the stranger to live in our house? Does it mean to share every meal with the stranger? Who is a stranger? A stranger who lives for 10 years in my town is still a stranger or not? Does the stranger need to pay taxes? So there are so many questions, and the Torah is not even touching those different questions. And this is what the Talmud will do. The Talmud will have a whole bunch of conversations, of discussions, of debates on those general values in order to find a way to transform them, to translate them into something that is possible to practice, into something that is possible to do. But someone who wants to act Jewly, wants to act as a Jew and opens the Talmud, needs to learn several opinions and choose his or her own opinion, his or her own conclusion. So someone who wants to act as a Jew, behave as a Jew, and opens the Talmud will read Rabbi A says so, Rabbi B says so, Rabbi C says so, Rabbi D, about each and every subject. There are plenty of different opinions. And this person needs to choose with which of those rabbis the person identifies more, and then practice. But we need to agree that it's not a very practical system, because not everyone has the time or the knowledge or the patience to open the Talmud and to study several pages in order to know how to wash the hands, to do netilat yadayim. If you want to wash your hands, yeah, and you will study several pages of the Talmud before washing your hands, it's not a very practical system. And this is the reason why the codes came into existence. The codification of Judaism is a process that came to simplify people's lives. So you don't need anymore to study pages and pages from the Talmud and to learn about tens of opinions in order to learn how to wash your hands or how to pray, or how to fast, or how to act with your wife and children and parents and neighbor. So the idea behind the codes is to simplify people's lives, to simplify the way in which someone needs, the amount of effort, the effort someone needs to invest and to devote in order to get to know how to behave and how to act. The problem is, and Yossi has a question, I will just conclude this sentence, Yossi, and I want to hear your question. The problem is that when you codify Judaism, you are actually choosing one answer and hiding all the others. So the code, those who wrote the codes, the codifiers, they substituted the individual that needed to study, to learn, and to choose. And actually, they are choosing by them. So when you have a code that establishes that the right way to wash your hands is like this, what the code is doing is revealing one opinion and hiding 6 or 8 or 10. And I consider it a pity, an impoverishment of Judaism, because the beauty of Judaism is exactly the fact that there is no single way to do anything. You have several ways to put on tefillin. You have several ways, several opinions on how many hours does someone need to wait between eating meat and drinking milk, and how to behave towards the stranger, and so on and so forth. So every issue in Judaism has tens of answers, and all of them are Jewish. All of them are legitimate. But the codes, in order to facilitate, in order to help the individual that cannot study tens of pages in order to learn how to behave, the codes ended up, in my opinion, causing the impoverishment of Judaism, because by revealing the right way, the right answer, the best path, it is actually hiding a lot of other possibilities that could be more interesting to that specific individual than that one chosen by the codifier. So, Yossi, please.
I don't want to ask a question. I want to make a comment.
Please.
And maybe I'll come up with a question. So the codes, the way I see the codes is really our norms and mores of our Jewish society. They're telling us how to behave, because we are born Jews. So they're telling us you have to pray 3 times, you have to eat kashrut, etc. Those are what we're supposed to do. The Talmud is more complicated because you have the Babylonian and you have Jerusalem. And both Talmud are bringing the discussion to a very high level. And they interpret certain phenomena, social phenomena, at a very high level. So, like you said, if you talk about the stranger, there are different interpretations. It's as if you're going for a master's degree at a higher level of education, and here you have the opportunity to look at Jewish values and see, can we take it to the next step? What does it really mean? When you talk about a stranger, I like what you said, what interpretation, but also about the stranger, if we have a discussion, do we adapt the values of the stranger, or the stranger is supposed to adapt our values? So if you take this within the context of today's society, this is where the discussion becomes interesting. Because if you look at Israeli society or in American society, we don't accept the stranger. We have codes and rules in civil society which says, well, if you want to move to my community, immigrate, you need to follow protocols, and I may not accept you. So it's very interesting how the Talmud interprets such a phenomenon. So I look at Talmud as a way to discuss issues now and in the coming years as our society evolves.
Yes and no. Yes, because it's really a book of conversations, of debates, of discussions. But by discussing the Constitution, by discussing the Torah, what the Talmud was doing also was establishing the red lines of Judaism, the frame of Judaism. So when the rabbis talk about 5 different ways to interpret a specific verse, they are saying to us, there are 5 possibilities, not 7, not 10, not 15, there are 5. So it's a conversation, but it's also a way to establish the framework in which legislation can be discussed. So at least this is the approach of the conservative movement. The conservative movement would say, I do not need to follow the code because I can go back to the Talmud and to study different opinions and be convinced that another opinion is better for my reality. But at the same time, the conservative movement does not want to create an additional opinion to those already established by the Talmud, which the reform movement would do. The reform movement would say, I don't need to be confined within the structure of the Talmud, the borders of the Talmud. I can create actually an additional possibility or several additional possibilities because I can go back to the Torah and interpret the verse in a very free way, coherent with my contemporary values. This is a debate between the reform and the conservative movement, whereas the reform movement will say, I go back to the Torah. And the conservative movement will say, the rabbis went back to the Torah and have already established the limits. And if we have 5 opinions, we need to stay with those 5 opinions. The Orthodox movement will elect one single code and will behave according to this specific code. And in this case, the code is the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch became the code for orthodoxy. The Orthodox movement considers Shulchan Aruch as the final word. And if the Shulchan Aruch determines that Rabbi B was right, I cannot go back to the Talmud and stay with Rabbi A or with Rabbi C. According to the conservative movement, yes, I can. Because there is a very famous phrase, Shulchan Aruch has voice, but doesn't have veto. Shulchan Aruch is one important opinion, but it's not the last word. Because I can go by myself to the Talmud and choose another possibility. Why did the Talmud decide not to erase the several opinions? Even when an opinion was defeated, the Talmud decided to keep it. Why? Because, according to the conservative movement, because we can revisit the law constantly, and we can decide that that opinion that was once defeated is more appropriate to my current reality. Even if this opinion was not appropriate to Shulchan Aruch, to Yosef Karu's reality in the 16th century, today in the 21st, I may say that a different opinion suits better. And it's legitimate because it's within the border, within the limits of the Talmud. So orthodoxy will somehow say Shulchan Aruch is the final word. The conservative movement will say Talmud determines the limits in which we can navigate. And the Reform movement will say the Torah establishes the values, and I can go back to the Torah and determine law to myself and by myself. So interestingly enough, and then I will hear what Bruce has to say, interestingly enough, the most important book to orthodoxy is not the Torah or the Talmud, it's Shulchan Aruch. And the amount of effort and hours they spend in yeshivot studying Shulchan Aruch is enormous. For the conservative movement, the most important book is the Talmud, because it's the book in which I can always find a better solution to my question within the limits, the framework of Judaism. And for the Reform movement, the Torah is the most important book because they would allow themselves to revisit Torah directly, not by the lens of the Talmud, but directly, and interpret in a very open and free way the Bible. Bruce.
Oh, you and I have touched on many of these topics before, so I come back to revisit a question. As soon as we step a 1/10 of a micron away from the Torah, and man starts to make interpretations, we are no longer dealing with the ethereal, but man's rules, whether by Orthodox code or by conservative or by Reform or whatever. But yet comes Yom Kippur, Malkeinu makes the decisions. How does Avinu Malkeinu decide which one of these rules is the one where we shall live or we shall die? or by fire, or by water, etc., etc.?
The answer depends on your view on Judaism and on development of Jewish law. So if you ask an Orthodox rabbi, he probably will say the Shulchan Aruch determines who will live and who will die. If you follow the Shulchan Aruch, you will live. If you disrespect Shulchan Aruch, you will die. And again, a conservative rabbi will say, I don't necessarily need to agree with Yosef Karo in everything. With all my respect, he knew his own congregation in the 16th century. I know my congregation in the 21st century, and I can go back to the Talmud, to the same Talmud that he studied, the same book, and choose another answer, another Jewish answer to the question in front of me. And the Reform will say, you know what, I don't need necessarily to abide to the Shulchan Aruch or to the Talmud, because the Talmud somehow is also a reflection of time and space. And the Torah, the divine Torah, is the book that should guide my life. And I can always go to the Torah and to reach new conclusions. Yes, Marty.
Very quick question. I always thought, I learned this a while back from Rabbi Platik, that the Shulchan Aruch was really a condensed or not condensed or put together of the whole Talmud. Used to call it the high school review book. That was a joke. That wasn't the way, he just wanted to make an analogy. What are your thoughts on that? I'm sure of what I'm saying, that's what he said.
Shulchan Aruch is not a summary of the Talmud, because the Shulchan Aruch will not give me the 5 or 7 or 8 or 9 different answers.
It just has one
for each question. The Shulchan Aruch will simplify my life, make my life easier, and will say, Rabbi Schlesinger, don't worry, I have the answer. The answer is B. But by simplifying,
one answer, just one answer.
just one way, just one answer to
I
every.
thought that's what Carol put together, right? Carol, the Shulchan Aruch.
Yosef Karo, yes.
Yeah.
Yosef Karo
Hundreds,
had chosen one single answer to each question in order to facilitate our lives, in order to make our lives easier.
So he may have different opinions than Rashi, possibly.
So this is one important point, Mari. Thank you for bringing. We have different codes, and they do not agree among themselves. So the fact that Shulchan Aruch determines us to follow Rabbi B does not mean that Rambam, Maimonides,
and
in his Mishneh Torah,
right,
is very, very important legislative work. He will not necessarily determine the same. He will say, you know what, I think Rabbi C or Rabbi D or Rabbi F is the right one. And for a long, long time, all those codes lived side by side.
And
what changed, just a moment, Mari, what changed in the 19th century is that the Reform and the conservative movement started to update the law and to change the law. And a group of rabbis saw themselves in a war against the reformers. And what was their weapon? Their weapon in this war was determining one single code for the entire Orthodox world. So the Shulchan Aruch was created in the 16th century, and for 300 years, it coexisted with different codes, and different communities would elect different codes. So Jews from Morocco would say, Maimonides is better for us. We don't want Shulchan Aruch. We want Mishneh Torah. And different congregations and different communities and different rabbis would elect different codes. But on the 19th century, when the conservative and the reform movement started, a group of rabbis actually founded Orthodoxy and elected the Shulchan Aruch as their official book. So they said, we need one single law in order to make our tribe, our group stronger. And we need to talk the same language and to behave the same way. Because if we have several different practices, then the reform movement will say, okay, what's the difference between you and us? You are acting in different ways and we are acting in different ways. You have your practices in plural and we have our practices. What's the difference? So the Orthodox movement, with a slogan in Hebrew, Chadash Asur Min Torah, the novelty is prohibited by the Torah. The advancement of Judaism is prohibited. They felt the need to establish one single book that would respond to the questions of the entire Orthodox world. And why the Shulchan Aruch and not Maimonides? This is a question that I want to go back to it in a while, because I want first to read an article with you, okay? Yes, Marty.
Just one quick, this is all based on the Babylonian Talmud, not the Jerusalem Talmud.
The Jerusalem, they all studied both. They all studied both, but the Babylonian is more important in establishing the law than the Yerushalmi, than the Palestine Talmud. The Yerushalmi is also called the Palestine Talmud. Okay, Chuck.
Yes. Do all the different Hasidic sects accept this also? And if so, why are they all studying 8 hours a day, 6 days a week?
For several reasons. First of all, the Shulchan Aruch is a huge book with lots of comments and interpretations that came after the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch was written in the 16th century, and there are many commentators that wrote books and books and books and books on the Shulchan Aruch. In addition to that, there are several questions that Shulchan Aruch did not discuss because it didn't exist back then. What does the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century say about transplant of organs? Transplantation of organs. Transplant or transplantation? Transplant.
Transplanting.
Yeah. What do they say about it in the 16th century? Nothing. About stem cells. What does the Shulchan Aruch say about the stem cells? Nothing. It didn't exist back then. It existed. They didn't know not anything about that back then. So there are several new issues that need to be discussed. And in addition to that, Chuck, Halacha, the law, is not the only thing. We have all the legends and the midrashim and the stories. So there are a whole bunch of things to be studied. The Shulchan Aruch is the most legislative work, the most important legislative work. Okay, so I will share with you my screen, and I would like someone to help me to read an article on the Shulchan Aruch, and I want you to help me to respond when we finish reading the article, one single question. Why was the Shulchan Aruch chosen by Orthodoxy to be the code? If it coexisted with so many different codes, why was the Shulchan Aruch elected to be the ultimative word, the last word, the code? This is the question that I want your help to respond. So let me share my screen, just a moment. I don't want this, I want this. Let me see. Here we are. So this is a website that I like very much called My Jewish Learning. And they have very, very good articles on several different issues. And this is their article. I'm just positioning my screen in a way that I can see the article and you at the same time. So the Shulchan Aruch. Who could help me and start reading in English? Lisa, please.
Ask the average Jew where to learn about Jewish law, and you'll probably be sent to the Bible or the Talmud. Once there, you may find yourself a bit confused. The Bible includes many laws, but generally offers little explanation of the details of observance. The Talmud, on the other hand, includes an excess of detail, but also incorporates multiple viewpoints, stories, and digressions. A person wondering, for example, how to light a Hanukkah menorah, what activities are permitted on Shabbat, or what one may eat during Passover, will have to weed through pages of discussion in order to find answers, and those may not be straightforward at all. Given the Talmud's complexity, scholars since the medieval period have attempted to codify Jewish law in an easily accessible format. In the 12th century, Moses Maimonides, Rambam, composed the Mishneh Torah, a summary of laws relating to all areas of Jewish life. This work, written in simple Hebrew, is meant to be accessible for the average Jew who does not have the skills or motivation to access Talmud. A century later, Jacob ben Asher produced the Arba'at Turim, also called the Tur for short, a code that addresses only the practical areas of Jewish law. Unlike Maimonides, Jacob ben Asher restricted his discussion to laws relevant to post-temple Jewish life and cited his sources, referencing different opinions when necessary. A little bit more. The Shulchan Aruch's beginnings.
Let's see if we have another volunteer. If not, it would be great, Lisa. Does someone else want to read? So just go on. Thank you, Lisa.
The Shulchan Aruch's beginnings. On the heels of the Tur, the next influential Jewish code of law was the Shulchan Aruch, literally the set table, written by Joseph Caro, 1488 to 1575. Caro was part of a Sephardic family that was expelled from Spain in 1492. After the death of his father, Caro was adopted by his uncle, Isaac Caro, the author of a commentary on the Bible. The Caro family eventually settled in Sfat, the area of northern Israel where the mystical circle of Isaac Luria then flourished. Both Isaac and Joseph Caro became part of this community of mystics. Joseph Caro originally set out to write a commentary on the Arba'a Turim that would cite sources not mentioned by Jacob ben Asher and that would differ from the Torah's conclusions. This commentary, named the Bet Yosef, reads like a set of footnotes to Jacob ben Asher's more concise statements of fact. In the introduction to this work, Caro explains that the expulsion of Jews from Spain and their subsequent dispersion among Ashkenazic communities had caused confusion about the rules of observance. Sephardic Jews often found that their inherited traditions differed from those of the Ashkenazi Jews into whose communities they had moved. With the dismantling of Sephardic communities, it was no longer clear who had authority to decide matters of law. By presenting all known sources on particular issues, Caro hoped to clear up this confusion. The Beit Yosef eventually became the notes for the Shulchan Aruch, which would become Caro's most famous and influential work. Originally intended as a crutch for those not sufficiently learned to read the Beit Yosef or the halachic works referenced there, the Shulchan Aruch soon became the most important code of Jewish law. We need someone else.
Okay, please, Barbara.
I have the article on my phone, so it's easier to read it from here, okay?
As long as it's the same article.
Oh, yeah, of course it is. I always use my Jewish learning all the time.
Perfect, thank you.
Caro divided his work according to the categories introduced by Jacob ben Asher. Like the Arba'a Turim, the Shulchan Aruch is divided into 4 sections. Ora Hayim, laws relating to prayer, Shabbat and holiday observance, and other rituals of everyday life. Yoreh De'ah, laws of kashrut, tzedakah, conversion, and other ritual matters. Evad Ha'ezer, laws relating to women and marriage, and Hoshen Mishpat, civil law, including sections on lending money, renting and buying homes, and worker-employer relations. I'm not sure if I pronounced the Hebrew properly. Within each of these 4 sections, laws on similar subjects are grouped together. Each section is divided into simanim, paragraphs, and those are further divided into se'ifim, subsections. A citation of the Shulchan Aruch thus might read, Hoshen Mishpat 335-1, meaning section Hoshen Mishpat, Siman 335, Seif 1. In general, the Shulchan Aruch presents laws in a straightforward way, with virtually no discussion. For example, Caro's instructions for lighting Hanukkah candles read, how many candles should one light? On the first night, one lights 1. From then on, one adds 1 each night until there are 8 on the last night. Although the Talmud and other earlier texts include other traditions for the appropriate means of lighting Hanukkah candles, Caro chose to present only what he considered to be the correct procedure in order to avoid confusing his readers. Anyone else want to read?
Yes, Roberta, please.
Caro and mysticism. It may seem strange that Caro was simultaneously a mystic and the most important codifier of Jewish law. We tend to associate mystics with meditative practice and with an emphasis on achieving visions of the divine. When we imagine a medieval legal scholar, we might conjure up an image of a very serious man who spends his days bent over a set of musty books. However, within the context of the mystical circle of Safed, Caro's double identity makes sense. For Isaac Luria and his school, the goal of religious observance was to reunite the parts of the divine being that had been scattered as a result of human disobedience. This process, known as tikkun, fixing, required first and foremost the practice of mitzvot. Luria and his followers believed that the performance of each mitzvah helped in some way to unify the various aspects of God. The composition of a compendium of Jewish law would thus help Jews to participate in this tikkun. For the most part, Caro's mystical leanings have little effect on his legal decisions. In some instances, however, Caro does explain a particular law with reference to a mystical teaching. Do you want me to continue?
And do we have another reader? So please.
Okay. Commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. When Caro published the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Moshe Iserles, known as Rima, an Ashkenazi legal scholar, responded with his own commentary on their Abba Turim, called Darkai Moshe. Learning that Caro was about to issue the Shulchan Aruch, Iserles abandoned this project and instead wrote a commentary on Caro's work. Iserles criticized Caro for often ignoring the opinions of Ashkenazic scholars, commenting that Caro's books are full of decisions that do not follow the interpretations of the sages from whose water we drink, the sages whose children's children we are. It has become a familiar joke that every time a person claims to have the last word on Judaism, multiple commentators appear to challenge the assertion. Famously, Maimonides had the chutzpah to claim that a person could read the written Torah and then the Mishnah Torah, and from them know the oral Torah and have no need to read another book. Not surprisingly, Maimonides' code did not become the last word in Jewish law, but rather almost immediately became the subject of numerous commentaries and critiques. Similarly, the Shulchan Aruch did not immediately achieve widespread acceptance. Many scholars thought publishing a comprehensive code of law was forbidden, fearing that readers of such a code would have no way of knowing the history or range of opinions on various laws. Rabbi Shlomo ben Yechel Luria, the Maharshal, a contemporary of Caro's, was the author of Yem Shel Shlomo, a commentary on part of the Talmud. In the introduction to that work, the Maharshal, I want to say Maharaji, but it's not, declared the impossibility of explaining every uncertainty in the Torah to the point that there is no disagreement. Rather, he argued each scholar should delve into the sources, add new interpretations, and decide among various opinions. Ironically, the Shulchan Aruch ultimately gained its legitimacy through the publication of two major commentaries by the 17th century Ashkenazic scholars. These works, known as Turei Zahav, Taz, and Siftai Kohen, Shach, and written by David ben Shmuel Halevi, Poland, 1586 to 1667, and Shabbatai ben Meir HaKohen, Lithuania, 1621 to 1662, respectively, respond to the critiques of the Shulchan Aruch by explaining Caro's reasoning, introducing alternative opinions, and offering their own conclusions. In treating the Shulchan Aruch as an independent work worthy of a commentary of its own, rather than as a poor cousin of the more extensive Bet Yosef, these two scholars secured the place of the Shulchan Aruch as the authoritative guide for code for generations to come. The best known later commentary on the Shulchan Aruch is the 19th century Mishneh Baruch, written by
Mishneh Brura.
Okay, which,
yeah, the Mishneh Brura.
Mishneh Brura, written by Yisrael Meir Kogan, which includes explanations and a collection of later opinions on the Orha Hayom section of the code. The 19th century also saw a number of attempts to abridge the Shulchan Aruch. The most famous of these is Shlomo Gansfried's Kizur Shulchan Aruch, which summarizes Caro's work while also incorporating some alternative opinions and contemporary customs. Someone else can pick up.
It's the last paragraph.
Okay. To this day, the Shulchan Aruch remains the most influential code of Jewish law. Contemporary legal scholars may, on occasion, disagree with Caro's conclusions, but they cannot ignore him. The proliferation of commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch has only solidified its central position in the canon. Almost 500 years after Caro produced a work intended primarily for those unable to study more complex legal works, his code has become the primary textbook for the most traditional Jewish schools and yeshivas.
Thank you so much, Roberta. Thank you so much for all the readers. So in order to conclude our meeting, and I want to anticipate that the next meeting we will devote to some laws and to some examples from the Shulchan Aruch. So we will dive into the Shulchan Aruch next meeting, and we will discuss some specific laws connected to the Sidur and to Tfilah, and then we will understand the Shulchan Aruch and the development of Jewish law. But to conclude today's meeting, I would love to have a conversation with you on why was the Shulchan Aruch elected as the code, the most important code of Judaism. Why, in your opinion, from what we read, do you think it was elected? Yes, Bruce, you have the first hand raised.
Because Joseph Caro said so.
Yeah, but Maimonides said so too, and so many people said so. Why the Shulchan Aruch prevail?
Because we're not accepting anybody but Joseph Caro. All these other people were wannabes.
Were wannabes? What's the meaning of wannabes?
Well, I
Wanted to
don't-
be Joseph Caro.
Right.
Who else wants to try to respond before we say goodbye? Yes, Rachel. You are on mute, Rachel.
I think it's because it's more mechanical about practical observance and doesn't include all the other, almost mystical things that my mom mentioned in the Mishnah. That's a guess.
Okay. Marty?
It's out of somewhere, but I think it's very pertinent to preserve as much as possible of the genuine Jewish law and custom, and is compatible with modern conditions.
Carol, please.
Growing up, I didn't have a choice. That was what we followed. The Shulchan Aruch. It made life easier for the family because you just did what it said.
Okay.
And
But
you
the question
didn't-
is, why not Maimonides? Also, Maimonides tells us what to do in a very simple way, but he was not the chosen one. The Shulchan Aruch was the chosen one, and I'll try to explain why. There is one iPhone with a hand raised, but I don't know who is behind that iPhone.
Yeah, hi, Rabbi. How are you? It's Greg.
Who is that?
Greg.
Who is?
Greg Gang.
Greg, please.
Okay. I think it's because it was meant and developed to be more approachable for the common man. And it was just easier for the common man to follow the Shulchan Aruch as opposed to the other commentaries, which are a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more difficult to understand.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have an opinion on why Shulchan Aruch was the chosen code? Why do we follow more Shulchan Aruch than other codes? We still study all of them, but we actually follow Shulchan Aruch. Whenever there is a conflict between Shulchan Aruch and other codes, the Jewish
That's
world
strange.
has decided to follow Shulchan Aruch. I will explain why. So the first reason is that Maimonides does not explain where he took his conclusions from. So it's not possible in Mishneh Torah to follow Maimonides' way of thinking because he does not prove, he does not bring any source. Maimonides establishes the law without any explanation. You need to believe in Maimonides in order to follow him, but he does not prove anything. In opposition to Shulchan Aruch, because Shulchan Aruch, as we read in our article, there is a previous work from the same rabbi, from Yosef Karo, called Beit Yosef. And Beit Yosef, in this book, Beit Yosef, Karo shows all the development, the entire development of a specific law before getting to his conclusion. So if you want to debate with Yosef Karo, if you want to debate with the Shulchan Aruch, you can read another book by the same author called Beit Yosef, and today both of them are published together, and you will see from the Torah until the 16th century all the relevant sources that made Yosef Karo reach that specific conclusion. So the first important thing is that Yosef Karo shows the thinking behind the conclusion. And other codes like Maimonides will not show the thinking behind. So there are things that Maimonides brought that no one knows. Where did Maimonides take it from? Because it was a specific tradition from Spain, from Egypt, that he's bringing to his work, and we cannot debate because we do not know where does it come from. So the first important thing is that the Shulchan Aruch will reveal his sources and his way of thinking. This is the first. The second important thing is that the Shulchan Aruch will include Sephardic and Ashkenazic worlds in the same book. And it did not exist before the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch will tell us how Sephardim would act, would behave, and how Ashkenazim would behave in regard to a specific law. And this is why, as we read in the article, there is this other person, Isserles, this other rabbi who was born in Poland and who wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and it was incorporated in the same book. So today when we say Shulchan Aruch, we are talking about Yosef Karo and Moshe Isserles together. There are two books in one, and it shows both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic traditions in regarding to a specific law. And this is also very important. The third reason is that he is the latest of the big codifiers. So he will study Maimonides and he will incorporate Maimonides in many of his conclusions. So this is something more or less similar to what happened with the Palestine and the Babylonic Talmud. Once the Babylonic Talmud was the latest, was concluded later in time, it incorporated most of the materials from the Palestine Talmud. The same in regard to the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch included most of the legislation that came before it. And there are three legislators that Shulchan Aruch will take into consideration as the most important legislators. Two of them were in our article. One is Maimonides, the other is the Tur, the Arba Turim, the Tur. And the third one is Rav Alfasi. Alfasi because he is from Fez, from Morocco, and he's called in Arabic Alfasi. So those three legislators were the source that inspired Shulchan Aruch. So those are the most important reasons why Shulchan Aruch became the code. One, because it shows the origins of the different laws. Second, because it contemplates both the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic worlds. And third, because it's the latest of the most important codes, and it would incorporate most of the material that came before the Shulchan Aruch. So I just want to check if you have any question or any final comment, and we will conclude. For the next meeting, we will open the Shulchan Aruch, and then we will study a little bit of some of the laws together. Any question or final comment? Thank you so much.